On this AirCheck episode, we invite you to be our guest to the audio version of our Facebook Live video.
Rich and I sit down to talk with you about AirCheck Season 1, its origins, development, our Season 1 guests, favorite moments, and the reveal for Season 2.
And away we go.
Welcome to AirCheck Season 2, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities, managers, consultants, owners, and your most humble hosts from Philadelphia, Rich DeSisto and Paul Kelly.
Well, here we are. Thanks for being here. I'm Paul Kelly.
Hey, I'm Rich DeSisto. Thanks, guys, for joining us on our Facebook Live. We've kind of modified the audio a little from the original video broadcast to satisfy a little more theater of the mind for this AirCheck episode. And technically, this episode can be considered episode 1 of our new season, but it's really a rewind and a fast forward as Season 2 is here. So with that being said, Season 2, Episode 2 is our second part of the AirCheck session we did with Danny Bonaducci. And what a Season 1, right, Paul?
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with Season 1. And Rich, I guess we should probably re-explain the origins of the AirCheck podcast that you came up with, the concept development. I mean, we had many beverages, many breakfasts, sitting in a diner in Cherry Hill, combing through these ideas. Why don't you share a little bit of what your original thought was to me about this?
Yeah, well, I had an idea a little over a year ago that I wanted to launch a podcast, but I didn't know what about. I wanted to present the content from an expert point of view, and I started to think about all the storytelling that we do as on-air personalities on the radio about things that we've experienced. And sometimes those stories end up being told to our family and friends. Paul and I go back 30 plus years as friends. We met working on the radio in Atlantic City at WZXL, and he and I constantly tell those stories, some good, some not so good. And we're not alone either. All of us in radio tell those stories of interviewing musicians or backstage encounters, good or bad promotions. So that's where this thing came from. And the term AirCheck, by the way, is the process by which you as a radio personality record your show for your own benefit and also for the program director to sit you down and listen and grade your work. So that's kind of the play on what we're doing here. And our goal is to offer up each episode of AirCheck, the podcast, to listeners that not only are in the radio business or were in the radio business, but that are not in the radio business, but still interested in hearing about these once-in-a-lifetime experiences that the radio industry does create. Paul, you have a great reference as to how we kind of present this of an old TV show back in the 70s.
Yeah, WKRP in Cincinnati was a television show that people in the radio and record industry loved, and there's plenty of other people that were not in the radio and record industry that also loved it. And so that's the level of relativity or explainability is how we want these episodes to be. So the people that are in radio, they know it, they love it, they understand it. And for people that aren't in radio, they're still going to enjoy these stories that happened inside the walls of the radio station. Rich, you left out a huge chunk of the origin and the concept of this thing. Rich leans across the table to me in this diner and says, I really need to learn about podcasting. I really don't know anything about it. So this polished product that you guys have seen has come from square one where neither of us, and I still know next to nothing about podcasting. Rich has done tons of homework, research, watching videos, conceptually crafting this thing and putting it all together from not knowing anything about podcasting. How many months ago before we even got into this thing? Rich, have you learned anything yet?
No.
So, kudos to Rich for being the strong backbone in this whole AirCheck podcast, if you will.
Thanks, Paul. You've done a big part as well in the planning and the storyboarding and soliciting and getting our guests in line and helping out with all the stuff that goes on in behind the scenes that a lot of people again aren't really aware of if you're not in radio as to how these things are planned out. There's a lot of stuff going on here for a 40-minute to an hour episode as you guys get to hit play and listen to it and enjoy. So thank you, Paul, for your contribution as well.
Hey, it's been fun. Let's talk about some of the guests that we had in season one. I mean, some were coworkers, some were friends of friends of friends that we're able to connect with. Cousin Ed, Danny Bonaducci, Eddie Trunk, Keith Roth, Neil Mursky, Nina Blackwood. Rich, you worked with Cousin Ed here in Philadelphia, WISP, and with each of these episodes that aired during season one, you and I each have favorite moments that happened during each of these interviews, as the guests did as well. Why don't you start with Cousin Ed? What jumps out at you from that episode?
Well, the story that Cousin Ed, that I actually have a part in, is a story about Metallica. Cousin Ed was the resident Metallica fan, other than Matt and Huggy on YSP back in those days, the mandatory Metallica feature and all that. But Cousin Ed had an opportunity to go out to Metallica headquarters out in California during the St. Anger sessions. And he was asked to go out there and interview the band for more of a national kind of presentation. But while he was out there, not only did he get to interview the band, each member of Metallica, but he was also invited to go and sit in on rehearsals. And that story is always cool.
Right before you go into this garage-esque studio, there's a big thing on the wall box, and it's full of earplugs, and it says, please put these on before entering. And I was not about to do that. If I ever wanted any type of music, especially Metallica in its purest form, it was that moment right there.
Yeah, right?
Cousin Ed was great. Danny Bonaducci was somebody else that we had on during season one. Actually, we scored a 2-part episode out of Danny. He was really fun, genuine, and one of the stories he told, which is a lot of what his show was a lot of stunting and pranking and things like that. And this was an event that happened inside the radio station he worked at in Chicago, the Loop, WLUP. Chicago is known for loops. Their highways are loops and things like that. So this radio station is called the Loop. Anyway, the parking garage was this, 10 or 15 story building. It was circular driveways all the way down. And he used to leave the air shift every day to see how fast he could get from the top floor to the bottom and scare the hell out of people. And he had another DJ that worked at the station that said, "You can't scare me." So anyway, he brought him along for a ride, and he called it karaoke.
So I got him in the car, and we started going fairly fast, not as fast as I could, but pretty fast. And he kept saying things like, see, I'm not screaming. We come around the last loop, and there's some lady pushing a baby carriage, which I then hit. He starts flipping out, screaming, and he's out of his mind. At the time, it was my wife with a doll in the carriage.
Doesn't even scratch the surface, man. We've got a lot more from Danny Bonaducci's Air Check session. We're pretty excited about that. One of our guests from season one, I'm still overwhelmed that we had a connection to get her on season one. As a big MTV fan, Paul and I both remember when it launched. But we had one of the 5 original VJs, Nina Blackwood.
They had chartered some buses and took us to this, funky bar in New Jersey. And fight in that room and the anticipation was like nothing I've ever experienced prior or after. And when that, the beginning, the and that rocket went off. I mean, there were tears, there were yells. It was like a baby being born. For all these people, many of whom had worked on MTV for months and months and months. And finally, everything was coming to this fruition.
So they couldn't see the launch in New York City because the cable company didn't have it, or they didn't have cable, something to that effect. So they got bussed from New York City to this little...
A dive bar in Jersey. The other thing about a lot of the guests we have, and people in radio already know, and people that aren't in radio may not know, radio is very tightly connected. Everybody seems to know everybody in one way, shape, or form. And one of our other guests, Neil Mursky, also happened to work at MTV somewhere along his career path, actually in the early days when Nina was there. Neil, a rock radio programmer, did a lot of great rock radio stations in Florida, then came into Philadelphia as well as Kansas City. And Neil's episode is so chock full of stories. One of my favorites was him talking with Bon Scott prior to Highway to Hell being released. This is just how many days or weeks before Highway to Hell's coming out. And Neil catches him backstage on his way to the stage to sing a show. And Neil catches him to talk for a few minutes about the tour and the upcoming album.
AC/DC was on the bill, and this was just maybe a month or two before the release of a couple of months before the release of Highway to Hell. And I just caught Bon backstage before he went on, and he was a fun guy, and he was really excited about this new album was going to come out and make him a millionaire. And a couple of months later, he was gone.
You mentioned my time with Cousin Ed at YSP. Neil actually hired me at YSP back in 1996. So another connection through the years of, our contemporaries being on here. And if we can add one more to the list, Eddie Trunk and I have a history together.
Perfect.
4.3 in New York City when it was the Pure Rock format. And now, of course, Eddie has gone on to do much bigger things. We all know about the metal show that was on VH1, and now he's all over Sirius XM radio. Here's a little bit of Eddie talking about being handed for the very first time a debut album from a band that turned into be a powerhouse. We brought him up with Cousin Ed. Listen to it for yourself, and you'll see what we're talking about.
Johnny showed up at the door unannounced with a bag under his arm, and I said, "What are you doing here, man? What's going on?" And he said to me, I got a band. I need you to play. I need people to hear this band. I can't get arrested with them. I put my whole life on the line, my money on the line, my house on the line for this band. I need to tell them they got played on the radio." I was like, "Well, leave it. I'll check it out after you leave. I'll let you know what I think." And he goes, No, you don't understand. I need you to play it now." And I said, "Okay, what is this band?" And the record he pulled out was Metallica, Kill 'Em All.
Another connection you're talking about as we keep the connections rolling here, none of this is planned, obviously, is Keith Roth. And Keith Roth, also an air talent on Sirius XM, but also has that New Jersey rock blood in him, and works at 95.9 The Rat in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, where he does a Sunday night show, The Electric Ballroom. The show has garnered such a magnetic attraction to artists that are in the area, the proximity to New York City. Keith, also being a musician, has that connection to the music industry as well, that the artists will show up in the studio. And this is a live show on a Sunday night from 8 until 10-ish, 11-ish, whatever. On this particular night, John Entwistle of The Who shows up with his own blend of coffee that Keith decided to join him on.
The first night that he came down, he came in Sunday night, middle of winter, and he asked if he can make, is there a place to make coffee? And Amy fired up a pot of coffee, and when the coffee was brewed, John Entwistle opened up a bottle of cognac and poured the whole bottle into the coffee, stirred it up, added some milk and sugar, and handed me a cup. And I felt really good. And then it was, by the second cup, I literally needed help. After they had left and everything, I needed someone to pick me up because, John Entwistle's a complete professional. And, I never had cognac, coffee with milk and sugar, but, John liked to party. But, you never knew he was feeling it.
As Rich had mentioned, we're looking for more. If you'd like to be part of future seasons, you're in the industry, you had been in the industry, you've got a story to tell, whether it's, like we say, from the company Christmas party or the company softball game or something that happened inside the station. Sometimes the stories that happen off air are just as funny as the ones that happen on the air. But the email address to get to us is aircheckme@gmail.com. And season 1 available. Rich, let them know how they can get to season 1.
Season 1 is available at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, also Spotify, and you can ask your smart speaker to play Aircheck Podcast.
Rich, why don't you continue with the rest of it?
Yeah, well, we jump right back into season 2 with part 2 of our session with Danny Bonaducci.
He's 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, and I'm 5'6", and at the time I fought him, I was 158. So theoretically, he was in charge of the fight, if you will. So when I saw how terrified Barry Williams, Greg Brady was, I tried to carry him, but he's so much bigger than me, the audience could tell, and they started booing. And when they started booing, I just dropped him. He hits the floor. They drag him to his corner. We wait a minute, 2 minutes, whatever. And then they say, how you feeling? He goes, oh, I'm all right. And they said, good. And they threw him back in the ring.
We're also thrilled to have 43-year rock radio veteran Debbie Calton.
I ended up staying in Philadelphia for 36 years, which is amazing to me because Philadelphia can be tough, on newcomers. The fact that I was embraced over the years by tried and true, dyed-in-the-wool Philadelphians, really meant so and still means so much to me.
And the funny continues in season 2 of Air Check. We have shock jock Kid Chris.
I ended up just sending in bits to Casey to see what would happen. And then one night, because on the West Coast, Stern would air live from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Then they would start it over for drive time. I got a call at like 4 a.m. from the board op screaming at me into the phone. He's like, Stern's playing your O.J. Simpson prank calls. And I was like, oh my God. And I remember jumping up and going, this is insane.
We also have Lori Lloyd. We have Randy. We have Andy Summers. We have Anita Wad. She was on the air all over the country, hugely successful. Now a media consultant, Lori Lewis.
If I hid Robin Thicke tickets on my radio station's website and I asked my afternoon jock to say, hey, look, we just hid tickets if you click around and you find them, the first person to find the tickets wins them. And I would sit back, like most program directors would never do this. I sat back and watched how many people would log on to the website after she said that. The numbers weren't weighted. It was real. I started getting fascinated with it, so much so that I knew I had to be honest with myself. And that's where it became my future.
And continuing the theme of consultants, we've got a radio consultant extraordinaire and former radio programmer, and if we can add, the inventor of the classic rock format, Fred Jacobs.
We really had a lot of fun. I mean, back then, the radio station was very much a reflection of who you were as a person. When I programmed in Detroit, there were really 4 rock stations, and that was the case in a lot of markets. I mean, Philly was like that. Chicago was like that. Big markets had 3 or 4 stations that were all kind of similar in that they played rock and they had personalities. So you really had to be a great radio station to stand out and win in that environment.
We even found an owner that would come on and tell some stories with us. He started out as a DJ in the early days of Baltimore. He was on television in Baltimore. He's in the Country Radio Hall of Fame. He invented the Froggy Country Radio format, and we're thrilled to have with us the owner, president, operator of Forever Media, Kirby Confer.
Kirby, there's somebody on the phone from Capitol Records. They need somebody to MC some gig. I don't know. And the guy said, this is Bill Turner from Capitol Records. We've got an act coming in. We're wondering, all the other DJs are busy, the guys who are the famous guys on our station. And, would you be available? And I said, yeah, I think I'm available. He said, fine. We'll send you a contract with $200. Would that be adequate? Yes, sir. That would be wonderful. Thank you. So I ran up to call the program director, a guy named Johnny Dark. And I said, Johnny, I got my first gig. He said, what is it? I don't know, Johnny. I got really excited. I'll have to call the guy back. I called Bill Turner back and I said, what is it? He said, you haven't heard of them. He said, but they're big in England. They're called the Beatles.
Wow. Another season of Air Check is here, a podcast about radio's personality from Radio Personalities. Remember, you can download or stream every episode of Air Check, season 1 or season 2, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast.
We appreciate your feedback too, so please subscribe and give us a great rating.
I'm Rich DeSisto.
I'm Paul Kelly.
Until next time.
Talk to you soon.
See ya.
Appreciate you sitting in for this episode of Air Check, a podcast about radio's personality from Radio Personalities. We're into season 2 and more on the way for you. Got questions, comments, or want to be on an upcoming episode? Email aircheckme@gmail.com. Musical props go to Chris Gordon. Announcer props. That's me, Greg O'Brien, the OB. Air Check Seasons 1 and 2 available now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. You can also listen on your smart speaker. Just say, Alexa, play Air Check Podcast, or OK Google, play Air Check Podcast. Air Check is the creation of RDPK Productions.